Hello, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. My name is Alp, and I'm marketing manager here at Enov. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to our Fireside chat on LinkedIn today. If you can hear and see me okay, do you mind just typing a plus in the chat so I know that everything is working technically? We do have a very interesting topic today on overcoming regulatory challenges for CLIA labs and startup IVD manufacturers. I am joined by two experts on this topic. Dave Petrich and Mann are joining me from the United States. Let us know in the chat where you're dialing it from, because we have over 70 people signed up for the session from all over the world. First guest, Dave Petrich, is a quality and regulatory executive with over 25 years of successful experience leading cross-functional teams to develop, manufacture, and commercialize IVD and medical device products. Dave, welcome to the studio.
Thank you, Alp. Hi, everyone.
Second guest from North Carolina, Hal has over 30 years of experience leading cross-functional teams. He specializes in strategy, execution, and quality in clinical trials across pharma, diagnostics, and CROs. Welcome, Hal.
Excellent. Hi, thanks, Alp. Hi, Dave.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everybody.
Thank you for being our guest today. We have only 30 minutes, so let's get started with the first question, which kind of is going to drive the session. Hal, my first question is for you. From your perspective, what are the biggest regulatory challenges CLIA labs and IVD startups face today?
Yep, that's the heart of what we're all here to talk about today. The biggest challenge is really just the increase in regulations and the increase in expectations from regulatory bodies about the requirements, how you're going to deliver data, et cetera. As you can see in this slide, it's a combination of the increase in the regulations as well as the uncertainties and the changes that have been happening. It's hard to keep up. We have here in the U.S. we have the FDA and things that have been changing over the last several years around that, all the way to the FDA actually coming up with a rule requiring LDTs, increased regulatory requirements for LDTs that was blocked by a U.S. federal judge. So again, just this increase in requirements and the uncertainty of where it's going from there. And it's not just here in the U.S. In Europe, IVD is changing over to IVDR and was originally required for all those changes to happen in 2024, I think, and then went to 2025, and now it's spread out to 2027 because of the complexities are there. So we have regulators that have a good idea to increase the safety and efficacy of our products, but with that comes additional work and requirements for labs and IVD companies across the board, not just startups. Dave?
Yeah, maybe I could add to that and speak a little bit more to the slide. I think the uncertainty is kind of driven by also the complexity of different types of products. Now, companion diagnostic products with a much higher risk profile, for example, are much more common. There's also AI-enabled medical devices, have entered as well. And then there's also sort of the geopolitical, factors that are operating too. We have a couple examples here of how things are becoming more stringent for CLIA labs and also all IVD manufacturers for that matter. In the US, we have decades, coming up to 2 decades of enforcement discretion for lab developed tests. And lab developed tests are manufactured and used all within a single laboratory. And starting in 2006, there was a draft guidance for IVD MIAs that are used within clinical labs, starting with some draft guidance, public meeting in 2010, a series of different draft guidances on the oversight of how the FDA would become more involved in overseeing lab developed tests, which are regulated by CMS, Center for Medicare. There was just a lot of feedback from all the stakeholders. The FDA issued a discussion paper in 2017. They passed an LDT rule in May of 2024, had some additional guidance documents, and then that LDT rule was blocked by a federal judge. So if you're sitting in a CLIA lab or you're in the IVD space, you kind of see this more stringent and more complex requirements that are developing. We could go to the next slide and just show a couple elements of the lab developed test rule. You could see there was about a 4-year transition period, and the progression kind of goes from like high risk areas into maybe lower risk areas. Starting off, it would have, if it was implemented, it would have been effective May of 2025 with medical device reporting, corrections and approvals, complaint files. You could see these are the high safety impact areas. All establishments, including CLIA labs that were making lab developed tests, would have to register their establishment, list their devices. They'd have to have appropriate labeling. If they were going to conduct a clinical study, they would need an investigational device exemption. And then by stage 3, other elements of quality system regulation would be implemented, including design control, purchasing controls, records, and CAPAs. And then for lab developed tests would have to go through pre-market review in the very same way that an IVD kit would go through pre-market review, starting with high risk, the companion diagnostic products. And then later, the final stage of implementation would be the lower risk products would have to basically fully comply with what IVD manufacturers would need. We could quickly go to the next slide, and this is just an example of the complexity and the changes that are happening. And if we look at the EU, certainly the IVDR and medical device regulation, MDR, were game changers, much more like the FDA in terms of the level of technical documentation and requirements for products. Within the EU, they don't use the term lab developed tests. It's in-house devices. But with the IVDR, for example, in-house devices have requirements. And also legacy IVD kits that are on the market and CE marked under the directive have now have to comply with all the dossier and technical file requirements. The original implementation time was 5 years for a transition period for legacy IVD, CE mark IVDs to comply with the IVDR. That's been extended 5 years. And a lot of it is because of the uncertainty and complexity that Hal was speaking to as well, but also the resources and the amount of work required in order to make this conversion. I think that the number of notified bodies supporting industry was insufficient. They're also implementing a UDAMED database that's not fully up and running yet. And a lot of IVD manufacturers haven't really made the transition because of the amount of work involved.
There seem to be quite a lot of challenges. Hal, I think you have a comment you would like to add to the as an
No, I
additional
just think,
challenge.
sure, sure. I think in general, the concept that IVDs manufactured by a large company and LDTs that are developed and ran in a single lab both have the same output, right? They both have the same output, but the differences in the requirements for getting them approved and to continue to manage their efficacy and safety are vastly different. And all these regulations are really moving LDTs closer to what the requirements are for an IVD manufacturer. So all of this makes sense. I guess that's kind of what I wanted to say. The increased regulations. I'm sure there are CLIA labs out there going, why are you doing this to me? I've been doing great on my own for the past 20, 30 years. But it's really the safety, right, of the patients out there. So
Let's stay on that subject for a second. So you were talking about an established manufacturer and a smaller company who's maybe just emerging. Do they feel these challenges any differently according to your experience?
yes, you just have to say yes, right? You think of a large IVD company that has maybe 20, 30,000 employees and a small startup that doesn't have that, right? And I think that's probably the biggest challenge for the smaller companies is that you don't know what you don't know, right? And the larger companies have a bit, can routinely have a better knowledge base. They know, even if they don't know, they know where to get it, right? They know what's happening. I can say, even working for a large company like Roche Diagnostics for several years, when IVDR hit or when the FDA makes changes to regulations, the complexities that happen are just numerous, and they're hard for a big company to deal with, right? So I guess for smaller companies, you don't, again, I'm going back to, you don't know what you don't know, and you got to know who to get to help you with those things along the way.
For the time to market, for example, or being inspection ready, Dave, you work with a lot of these companies before. The numerous challenges that you've named, how do they typically affect like a time to market or inspection readiness?
It has a huge impact. I mean, I 100% agree with Hal that larger companies are better positioned. They have more resources. They have more institutional knowledge in terms of the regulatory landscape for labs and also manufacturers. And quite frankly, they also have better tools for providing the level of documentation required. If you're a startup, or if you're in a CLIA lab and you have a higher risk type of product, that risk classification within the U.S. would be a class 3 pre-market, a PMA pre-market approval, and that requires a modular submission over a period of time. It requires a pre-market inspection. It requires the approval of your regulatory submissions, which is a very large dossier, and annual PMA inspections, every single year. If you're a startup company, having the know-how and having the right tools to really do that, I think is a big challenge. And it's a big challenge for larger companies too, because they have more products in their portfolios. But I think that the know-how and the tools really make a huge difference as well.
Interesting point, because we've advertised the session as startup IVD start manufacturers, for example. So what would you say to companies where would companies need to start if they're, for example, moving to digital from paper for an inspection readiness, for example, or digital to compliant digital, where do they even start?
Mm-hmm. I could start on that, then maybe Hal can jump in. But
Sure.
I think you have to really start with the basics of a quality management system. Probably starting with how you're managing your documents and how you're controlling revisions and how you're capturing records. But I think that when for a company that's getting started, I really advocate planning. Plan your analytical studies, plan your clinical studies, know what your regulatory pathway is, because analytical and clinical studies are extremely expensive. And if you're going to be marketing your product in the US and the EU and China and other places, it's really important to sort of plan that activity. But I recommend starting very basic elements of document control and record control and design control. Design control is one area that you don't really have a chance to do it over. So you should really do it right the first time, and you should have the right tools in place to be able to do that. And as your company grows and the complexity and number of products grow, hopefully you have a foundational quality management system, and preferably digital, that can grow with the entity as well. But Hal, please, maybe you can add to that.
Yeah. Well, it didn't seem all that long ago that the whole world was on paper, right? And then paper became Excel spreadsheets, right? And so, wow, I'm digital, right? Because I've got Excel spreadsheets. But the world has gone, way, significantly past that. And I think that regulatory bodies are they're to the point where they're expecting digital records. When they show up, I've seen the auditors that show up, and they want here's the 50 documents I want to see, download them onto this flash drive so I can go and look at them and how they want to review them. So it's kind of an expectation, and I think that's going to continue to grow. The ability to share information across studies, across products, across, as you do your next one, as you do your next version of an assay or whatever, having a compliant digital system really helps to drive and make that easier.
We won't be seeing a truckload of paper going to a health authority in a long time, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Dave,
I'm just going to jump in, Hal, and mention too, the FDA has been mandating electronic submissions since 2017. And so it's becoming a requirement. But one other factor besides the efficiency and how it could become unmanageable to work with paper is kind of the advent of AI-enabled tools. And, that also requires electronic formats. If you're just starting out, there is some effort, but the sooner you go digital, I think there are tremendous advantages. And as I mentioned, it's a requirement for regulatory submissions.
When we talk about digitization, Hal, you said it wasn't so long ago that the world was on paper. Do you have a quick success story that you can share with the audience where digitization made a measurable impact, for example?
Sure. Probably have a couple of them. A really easy one is you have an employee that suddenly leaves the company, and if things are not done in a digital system, even if they're done in Word, of course, and in Excel, things that are in progress but not quite finished yet are hanging out somewhere on a laptop, on somewhere else, and being able to go into a digital system where these things are being started from the beginning all the way through, you get to pick it up and you get to finish some of those things. So I've certainly seen that. There's also, I mean, I've seen entire programs be saved because they had appropriate digital systems. In the IVD, in the big IVD world, the next version of an assay or a system may happen periodically. Maybe it's 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. You get that next version and what have you. Quite often, the regulatory bodies are expecting very similar data to what you had in your previous submission. But the industry changes over that time, and maybe there are progressions in medical treatments where you can't get to the same type of data that you could get 7 years ago. And so by having appropriate digital systems, we've been able to look back at old submissions and actually narrow it right down to samples that have specific values from specific patient cohorts that we can't get anymore. And the FDA has allowed us to bring those samples and demonstrate that we could test them again and get the same answer that we got years ago. And that's, again, saved entire submissions, millions of dollars worth of work and effort that have been helped along just because things were appropriately digital and viewable across systems. So,
and documented as well. Dave, is there anything you would like to add?
My experience is more in the regulatory area, and I worked at Roche for a number of years, and we had some submissions in binders where you have like a 10-foot long table, and you have all of these binders piled up. And also, during inspections, we would routinely need to get boxes and boxes from Iron Mountain, I believe, and then filter through information. But you get to the scale where paper really doesn't make sense. It's prone to mistakes. It's prone to missing signatures. It's hard to find. It's voluminous. All the various things that Hal had mentioned. So I think the digital solutions really do pay off, and I'm really impressed by startups and CLIA labs too that have a really foundational quality management system that can grow as the products and the complexity of the work grows as well.
Hal, and Dave, I've heard you spoke about different things. You've spoken about keeping records correctly, having the right people at the right place, keeping good documentation, making sure that the system is actually being used and validated. Hal, based on your experience, and if I'm a startup, where should I focus on first? Should I focus on documentation, data integrity, training my people, validating my system? What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think you got to start with documentation, right? If it's not documented, it didn't happen. I know that's kind of cliche and everybody knows that, and et cetera, but you have to have good documentation. The appropriate digitization of that information is absolutely helpful, necessary. The quality of that document, right? So you can't start. None of these individually are gonna make it happen, right? You need the documentation. You need the integrity of that data that's in there. The digitization is fantastic, but it also needs to be it needs to be appropriately planned and implemented and et cetera. So yeah, it goes all the way. start with documentation. Make sure the integrity of that data is there. Make sure the digitization is appropriately implemented, qualified, et cetera. Dave, anything else there?
No, I mean, I fully agree. If I'm a quality regulatory background, so I would say all of it, but no,
Right.
I think it does make sense to start with documentation and data integrity, but any of these breakdowns in documentation, data integrity, training, or system validation undermines the confidence of how safe and effective your product or your test really is. And if somebody's not trained and they're performing testing, how do you know they really performed it correctly? Or if you have holes in your data, when you have a regulatory submission, you have to include line listings of all of the data, for example, and so you can't have gaps in data integrity or traceability. And there's an entire ecosystem that's required to ensure that your data are valid and you're complying with the regulations. But I think if you're a smaller entity, you could kind of ramp up, starting with documentation and data integrity, and then kind of putting in the other pieces. And I think if you do have an IT solution that is scalable and it's integrated, there's a tremendous advantage to that, as opposed to disparate systems or homegrown systems or whatever.
Yeah, and I think there's a misconception that only big companies can do digital. Only big companies can have these electronic systems, and I think smaller companies have that opportunity, and they're becoming more and more. The systems are becoming more and more available, and available at a smaller scale. And I think that the efficiencies that can be gained by those, the reducing the risk to losing information, not having it. You hate to go through all that work for a regulator to say, nope, it's not approved, right? It's not there. And these systems can really help to minimize the risk and increase efficiencies over time, et cetera. So it's not as expensive as you think, I think.
Absolutely. And I think what you said, Hal, can be applied literally to any other industry out there.
Exactly.
Let's stay in diagnostics for a second, right? So Dave, you mentioned your regulatory background. For the US and perhaps for the rest of the world, how do you see these digital tools that are more and more available today shaping the future of regulatory compliance in diagnostics, for example?
Well, I think it's the same points that Hal had mentioned in terms of efficiency and being able to sort of grow, with the company. That part is incredibly important, that you can kind of grow with your tool. But right now, there is a artificial intelligence revolution, and I go to a lot of regulatory conferences. It's by far the single one, the most common topic and the most popular type of topic. The FDA is kind of using AI, for some of its work. They're not going to be using AI to make a safety and effectiveness decision per se, but it can be a workhorse if you have the right, if you're digitized and you have electronic records, finding those records, doing medical research, planning studies, finding samples, enrolling subjects. If you're not paying attention to AI, I think you might have your head in the sand, and you could really, miss out in the opportunity to stay on that cutting edge and to be efficient and to get things done that other companies will be doing for sure. And I'm not saying that AI will do everything, but I think it's a revolutionary tool where if you're digitized, you're in position to really take advantage of that.
I think it's one of those topics that everybody is talking about right now, not only in regulatory, but you're right, regulatory seems to be one of those where AI is a very, very hot topic. I've heard you guys give a lot of advice to a lab or a startup. You said digitization, you said perhaps look at AI, keep your documents in order, so to say. If you could, for example, Hal, give one piece of advice, like as a summary of what we've discussed, what would it be?
Oh, I'd say, it's something that Dave alluded to as well earlier, and it's really plan for this. I think digitization and automation and et cetera, having access to information, the ease of use, et cetera, are all, critically important for companies to take that next step. If you're if you're very small and you have one very simple test, maybe it's okay. But the moment that you really need to move to the next level, you need some sort of digitization of what you're doing. So I think it's plan. I think it's explore. I think there are options out there. There are, again, the products are becoming much more readily available, and there's multiple providers of these tools. So do some homework, get in there, see what makes sense for your organization, and if you need help, get help. Reach out to an expert, to a consultant, to someone that can help you take that next step.
Thank you, Hal. And Dave, what would your concrete advice be, for example?
I do like this list, and I do 100% agree with the planning aspect. But if you're in the medical device or IVD and also pharmaceutical industries, number two for me is super important. Data integrity and traceability are really integral to the safety and effectiveness of whether you have a lab developed test or if you have an IVD kit. And I think the data, I think of it like liquid gold. It is like so valuable, and it's very expensive. If you're going to do a multi-site clinical study, for a PMA level product, that is a very expensive undertaking. And so I think it's very important that you sort of plan out your analytical and clinical studies, and you look at real world evidence, real world data, and how can you sort of leverage your studies and collect your data in an efficient way, and then be able to submit it to the FDA and other national competent authorities. And I think that's where the digital solutions come in. It's an investment, yeah. But as Hal mentioned, I think doing your homework and seeing what works for you and seeing what would work and grow with your entity, makes perfect sense, because at some point in time, you're probably going to get forced into it, or you're going to be managing so much paper that you're not going to be able to sustain it as you grow. So I like data integrity and traceability, and also really digitizing, having a good tool that you can kind of grow with over time.
Fantastic. I think you really made a great point there, where you need to tackle a problem before it becomes the elephant in the room, so to say. We are right on time, guys. This has been a very lively conversation. I can only thank you a million times for being our guest today and sharing your insights. For those that are wondering, the audience, the recording and the visuals will be immediately available. We do also have more resources you may want to look into. I'll post the link to those resources on the chat in a couple of minutes as well. We have a podcast, we have a newsletter, we have an insider. The recording will also be available on our website as well as on LinkedIn shortly. Dave, Hal, I want to thank you again all the way from Belgium for the conversation, for your time, for the interesting insights, and for the audience for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you again in our future Fireside chats for sure. Have a great day, afternoon, and evening. Take care.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, everyone.